They had their trial. I've got the notes of the trial, and they talk about the secret handshakes, they talk about the secret works, they talk about the espionage. The entire notes of the trial are recorded, and the involvement of the Knights of the Golden Circle in this, and what they were doing, and the people involved, and the heads, and the groups, and so forth. The trial went on. These men were then sentenced to death, to be hung immediately. Certain lawyers came forward and said, you can't do that, you have to give them the right to an appeal, at least. And the military said, no, they're going to hang by such and such a date. So members, again, certain lawyers, then said, well, let's petition the president to then stay the execution until an appeal could be heard. The president heard that the stay of execution was coming to his desk, and he took off on a fishing trip. And I'm not kidding. He literally took off on a fishing trip and said, I am incommunicado. I cannot be reached. And he grabbed his fishing pole and he left the office and then told everybody else, run the place till I get back. I'll be back in such and such a date. He made sure that date was after the execution would have taken place, or I think it was after the last date of an appeal to the president could be made, one of the two. Well, it was, I think, either his Secretary of State or his Vice President. When that petition came in, the Vice President signed it in the President's signature because he had been doing that right along. All these papers that would come in, say, Mr. President, you have this to sign, this to sign. He'd say, sign my name. Yeah. Pardon? Question is, who's the president? I can't recall who's in office. I know this. I used to know all the people right by first name, middle name, and last name. This is referred to as the Great Treason Trials of Indianapolis. Right. Right. Yeah. I don't recall the president, though. But if you want to check into this and do some interesting reading, it's called either the Treason Trials, the Indianapolis Treason Trials, or the Great Treason Trials of Indianapolis. It has various titles, and there are books that are out on it that you can read. And it's pretty amazing reading when you read the way that some people were railroaded straight through a court trial. They might as well not have even shown up. They might as well stayed in jail for the good it did them. At any rate, I think it was the Vice President that signed the papers in the President's signature and passed them back, staying the execution. There was an appeal. The appeal went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that a military tribunal has no jurisdiction over a private citizen in a state that is not at war. And it was one of the first and greatest Supreme Court decisions made up to that point. And it was over the Knights of the Golden Circle. Many professors in universities will tell you that this group didn't exist, that there's nothing in history to show that they had any effect one way or the other. There is. There's plenty out there. I said I'd go toward the history end a little bit for a few people. Going back to Jesse James, a man came forward by the name of J. Frank Dalton, and he came forward to a newspaper in Missouri and to a couple of reporters, one by the name of Rudy Trello and Joe Wood. I've spoken to Joe Wood because Rudy Trello's passed on. His wife, Rudy Trello's wife, operates the Jesse James Museum in Stanton, Missouri. So she's very aware of what took place. These two reporters took it upon themselves to prove that this man was a fraud, that Jesse James, the man that called himself Jesse James, was a fraud and not to be believed. And in trying to disprove his claims, they ended up proving him to the best of their knowledge. They came up with autopsy reports later on after he died of every mark and every scar on his body. They were total believers. Joe Wood, when he talked to me, he said a man that was introduced to him as Travis came in I think it was like 1948 at a meeting, came into that meeting with Jesse James, and the two of them looked at each other. He said, and the one was this younger, really younger, I'm trying to think of who it was, but, pardon? I think so. Using a fake name. But Jesse said hi to him. Travis looked at him and says, "Hiya, Jess," and looked at him straight in the eye. Joe Wood says to me, he says, "You had to be there." He says, "When I write this down in my book of what happened," he says, "the words don't say it." He says, "You had to be there to see the expression on these two old-timers' faces as they looked at each other and the smile of recognition." He says, "You couldn't lie about something like that, and you couldn't make it up." He says it was at that point that he became convinced that the man that was laying there in that bed was really Jesse James, talking to the other person. There were other people that were introduced to Joe Wood that Joe Wood did not know who they were until 2 years ago when we visited him in St. Louis. There was a man there, I think that was, I can't think of the name of how he was introduced to Joe Wood. I just don't remember the details. But it was Brushy Bill Roberts that was introduced to him, and other members that were originally very famous outlaws, and they were introduced to Joe Wood with very common names. And we finally, in this meeting a couple of years ago, Joe Wood, we gave him the names of these people and who they really were. And he said he had no idea that he was in the company of a band of outlaws as he was doing this reporting. J. Frank Dalton acquired a companion in his later years by the name of Lee Hawk. Lee Hawk has a number of children. Two of them are Jesse and Woody James. They have evidence that they're willing to show to proper people that have good intentions that Lee Hawk was a grandson of Jesse James. His name was changed in the beginning, that Lee Hawk was a grandson, and that Jesse James took Lee Hawk as a child and placed him with his sister to be raised, and that Lee Hawk really is a grandson and Jesse and Woody are grandsons. They have about 17 notebooks of information. Each notebook has pages and pages and pages on the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they're with the help of an attorney by the name of Carr down in Texas and one of the universities, they're sorting through all this to prove their lineage and prove where they came from and who they are. And that's an ongoing story right now. Jesse and Woody and some financiers from, I think it is Australia, a friend of mine by the name of Dewey Malay, were all involved in a piece of property in Waco, Texas, which has been in the news all of last year. And there was supposed to be a safe that Jesse James had in his railroad depot there, and it had documents and it had maps to locations and documents explaining who they were and what they were doing and why and who was involved in the correct names of everybody. It was the last document that he could give to history to be found someday. And Jesse James had built railroad tracks coming out of the back of the depot and rolled the safe out there and set it down in a location on this property and marked it by putting markers on the gravestones in a black cemetery that was just a short distance from there. The people went to dig it up. They dug it up some years back. The cable snapped and it dropped back in and tumbled, and they tried various efforts to get it out. Recently they pumped several $100,000 into the project. They still couldn't find the safe. There are pictures of that safe the first time it surfaced with Lee Hawk involved in it. And that safe is still down there. So this whole thing is still ongoing with the Knights of the Golden Circle and who was involved and what was involved. The United States government is actively pursuing these stashes that they have. There are groups of the government that don't want them found. They go about destroying markers. There are groups of the government that do want it found to put us back on the gold standard. So there are many players that are out there right now, and you're never quite